The table was set for 12. I sat at the end, watching my son carve the roast, just like his mother taught him. I thought it was just another Sunday, but as soon as everyone finished eating, he stood up and tapped his glass. "We're selling the family business," he said. "You're getting nothing." It was like the words bounced off the silverware. My daughter-in-law grinned. My grandchildren clapped. Even my brother, my own flesh and blood, nodded like he was proud. I kept quiet, feeling my chest tighten. I remembered building that business from nothing, starting out in a garage, working nights just to keep the lights on. All those years, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays spent counting pennies and signing checks, so they'd never have to struggle. Now they were cheering. I forced a smile. "Who's the buyer?" My son puffed up his chest like he'd won the lottery. "Everest Holdings," he said. "They're paying $40 million. The number didn't shock me. I'd heard it tossed around the boardroom all year. But hearing it from him, with that look in his eyes, felt different. I set my fork down, took a deep breath. "Son," I said, almost laughing, "I am Everest Holdings." Suddenly, you could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. The room went quiet. My son's face dropped. My daughter-in-law nearly choked on her wine. I looked around the table at the family I thought I knew. The people I'd worked for, worried for, hoped would carry on my name. All I saw were strangers with familiar faces. Have you ever been surrounded by family and felt completely alone? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. But in that moment, I knew some goodbyes are silent. Nobody moved. I could see my son's knuckles turning white as he gripped his chair. My brother was the first to speak, clearing his throat. "Is this a joke?" he said, voice shaky. I looked at him calm. "No joke, Mark. I put Everest Holdings together last year. All those business trips you tease me about? That's what I was building." My son started to protest, but I stopped him with a hand. "You never asked. You were too busy planning your big exit." My granddaughter looked at me, confusion in her eyes. I wanted to explain everything to her, but this wasn't the time. My daughter-in-law tried to laugh it off. "You can't just buy your own business from yourself." I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. "I didn't. I built something bigger and waited. Watched who would stand with me, and who would push me out the second they smelled money." My son looked angry now. "You're not making sense, Dad." I nodded. "Maybe not to you, but to me it's clear." Nobody said another word. The only sound was the ticking clock. I pushed back from the table and stood up. My knees ached, but my heart was steady. I looked at each of them. The people who shared my blood, my roof, my dreams. "I spent a lifetime thinking loyalty was automatic," I said. "Turns out it's just another thing people are willing to sell." My brother reached for my arm, but I pulled away. "You all made your choice before dinner," I told him. "Now I'm making mine." I left my plate untouched. Walked to the hallway, took my coat from the rack. Not one person tried to stop me. Have you ever realized your family can hurt you worse than any stranger? As I stepped outside into the cold, I wondered what would matter to them in the morning, the 40 million or the man who made it possible. The cold air hit my face as I walked to my truck. I didn't look back. The windows glowed warm behind me, but inside, the people felt colder than the wind. I sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, letting my breath fog up the glass. 40 years ago, I bought this truck brand new. Paid for it in cash the day I signed the first contract for our business. It creaked now, but it still ran. Sometimes the old things are the only ones you can count on. I started the engine and just sat there for a while, staring at the porch where my grandkids used to run to greet me. I wondered if they'd remember me as the grumpy old man who left, or as the one who built everything they had. My phone buzzed. A message for my son. All it said was, "Why?" No apology, no regret, just confusion. I thought about replying. I wanted to tell him that trust isn't something you buy or sell. It's built one day at a time, in the quiet hours when nobody is watching. I wanted to remind him of the nights I stayed up with him during his fevers, the mornings I packed his lunch for school, the days I gave up my own dreams to help him chase his. Instead, I put the phone down. Sometimes, silence says more than 1,000 words. I drove through the empty streets of town, past the bakery where I bought donuts every Saturday for my wife, past the church where we said goodbye to her years ago. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right anymore. I parked near the old factory, the heart of the business we built. The sign still shone in the dark, Henderson and Sons. I stood outside, looking up at it, hands stuffed in my pockets. Have you ever built something with your own two hands and watched others take credit for it? I stood there in the quiet, the only sound my own breathing, and realized this wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about being seen. And tonight, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I leaned against the cold hood of my truck, watching the lights flicker in the office windows. I remembered when I used to stay up all night in that building, fixing machines myself to save a few dollars. Back then, I thought hard work and sacrifice meant something. I thought it earned loyalty. Tonight, I saw how easily family could forget. I pulled out my keys. I still had access. They never thought to take it from me. Maybe they assumed I was too old to matter, or too soft to fight back. That's the trouble with getting old. People see wrinkles and forget the steel underneath. Inside, the factory smelled like oil and old memories. I walked the length of the floor, running my hand along the machines. Each one had a story. Each dent and scratch was a chapter I'd lived. I sat down in my old office chair. The same one I bought secondhand the year the business finally made a profit. The leather was cracked, but it fit me better than any chair ever could. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a dusty envelope marked for emergency only. Inside were the original papers, proof that I'd quietly made myself the majority owner years ago, when my kids were too busy growing up to care. They never asked how the business survived the hard years. They never saw the loans I paid out of my own pocket, or the days I went without so they could have a little more. I stared at the paperwork. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was dignity. Have you ever realized that standing up for yourself doesn't mean hurting anyone else? It just means refusing to disappear. I took out my phone, snapped a picture of the papers, and sent it to my son. No words, just the truth. Then I leaned back, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, peace. I didn't need to raise my voice or slam any doors. Sometimes the loudest statement is made in silence. Tomorrow, the family would wake up and realize what they'd truly sold. I didn't sleep much that night. The house felt emptier than usual. I sat in my old recliner, watching the sunrise through the living room window, coffee cooling in my hand. The phone started buzzing before dawn. First my son, then my brother, then the family lawyer. Missed calls, voicemails, and messages all piled up. I didn't answer. I let the quiet stretch on. By noon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find my son, hair messy, eyes red. He didn't step inside, just stood there in the doorway. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, his voice small. I looked at him for a long moment. "Would you have listened?" He swallowed hard. "We were just excited. Thought we finally made it. We didn't mean to push you out." I nodded. "But you did." He looked down at his shoes. "Is it true? You're still the majority owner." I held his gaze. "Yes, and I always was." He shifted his feet. "So what happens now?" I set my coffee on the table. "That depends on you. This business was never just about the money. It was about family, about working hard together, building something we could all be proud of. But you forgot that." He wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." I didn't say anything for a while. The silence between us was heavier than any words. Have you ever seen regret in your child's eyes and wondered if it was too late to fix what's broken? He finally looked up. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, both quiet, as the sun climbed higher. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't standing up for yourself. It's letting someone you love face the truth. That day, I realized my son needed something more than money or power. He needed a chance to remember who he was, and who we were, before greed got in the way. We sat together in the living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, but neither of us seemed to notice. My son picked at a thread on his shirt, struggling to find the right words. I let him sit in the quiet, let him feel the weight of everything that had just happened. Finally, he spoke. All those years, I thought you were just stubborn, set in your ways. I never realized you were protecting us. I shook my head gently. I wasn't perfect. There were times I was too hard or too silent. But I always tried to do right by this family. That business wasn't just my work. It was my way of making sure you'd never have to go through what I did. He looked at me, tears close but not falling. I messed up, Dad. I took a slow breath. Sometimes we all do. The trick is what we do next. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Do you think the others will understand? I glanced out the window, watching cars roll by. Maybe. Maybe not. But understanding starts with honesty. Not just words, but actions. We talked for hours. Not about the company or the money, but about things we hadn't spoken of in years. Memories, old hurts, and dreams left behind. I could see a part of the boy he used to be, before business deals and dollar signs got between us. My phone buzzed again. A message from my granddaughter. Are you okay, Grandpa? I smiled for the first time all day. I'm fine, kiddo, I wrote back. Sometimes, people just need a reminder of what matters. Have you ever wished you could go back and say the things you never said when you had the chance? As evening came, my son stood to leave. He paused at the door, his shoulders not as straight as before. Thank you for not turning your back on me, he said quietly. I watched him walk out, a little older, a little wiser. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope, not for the business, but for my family. The days after our talk felt different. My son called more often. Sometimes we didn't even talk about the business at all, just regular things, like how the tomatoes were coming up in my garden or how his youngest lost a tooth. The silence between us started to soften, little by little. One evening, he came by with my granddaughter. She handed me a card she'd made in school. On the front was a drawing of our old factory, the sign a little crooked, but you could tell it was ours. Inside she'd written, "Thank you for building this, Grandpa." I felt my eyes sting as I hugged her close. Sometimes, the smallest gestures say more than any boardroom speech. Later that night, my son and I sat on the porch. He turned to me, serious. "Dad, I want to fix things. Not just the paperwork. I want us to work together again. I want my kids to remember where all this came from." I nodded. "That's up to you. It's never too late to start again, but it's not easy. Trust takes time." He stared out at the dark, thinking, "I know, but I'm willing to earn it. I just hope you can give me that chance." I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we still had. I remembered the first years in that garage, when every dollar mattered and every mistake hurt. Somehow, those struggles had brought us closer then. Maybe, in a strange way, losing each other now was the only way to find our way back. Have you ever wished life gave you a second shot to do right by the people who matter most? The next morning, my son called a family meeting. This time, the voices were quieter. The talk was about memories, not just numbers. Even my brother apologized, his voice rough with regret. We didn't fix everything in a day. But as we sat together, sharing old stories and new hopes, I saw a glimmer of the family I thought I'd lost. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe in second chances. A week later, the family gathered at the old factory, just like the early days. My son stood beside me, hands tucked in his pockets, nerves showing in his voice as he addressed everyone. No more big speeches about money or deals, just a simple apology and a promise to do better. My granddaughter ran through the rows of machines, giggling, her laughter echoing off the walls. My brother brought coffee and pie, saying little, but the handshake he gave me was firmer than it had been in years. My daughter-in-law asked me for advice on the books, finally treating me like more than a name on a deed. As I watched them, I realized that what I'd built all those years wasn't just a company or a bank account. It was a place where my family could come together, mess up, fight, and still find their way back to each other. The money never mattered as much as they thought it did. They just needed to see that for themselves. Later, as the sun dipped behind the factory roof, my son pulled me aside. "Dad, thank you for not giving up on us," he said. I squeezed his shoulder. Just remember, you can lose money and get it back. But if you lose trust, you might never find it again. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I know that now. We walked out together, the family behind us. I locked the door one last time, not because it was the end, but because it was a new beginning. I left the keys in my son's hand. Have you ever realized that real revenge isn't about getting even? It's about showing what you stand for, even when no one's watching. As I drove home, the night felt warmer and my heart lighter. The family had tried to cut me out. But in the end, they found their way back, not because I fought them, but because I stood my ground and reminded them what truly matters.